Welcome back. Well, as mentioned before the break, the National Security Advisor told MPs today the Atwell security breach was a faux pas and not necessarily a rogue mission by the India government. He said he confided in reporters to correct misinformation on the attempted murderer's invitation to a Prime Minister reception in India in February. Let's bring in three members of the Safety and National Security Committee who were asking questions of Daniel Jean earlier today. Mark Holland is a Liberal Public Safety Parliamentary Secretary. Aaron O'Toole, Conservative Associate Member of the committee. And Matthew Dubé is the NDP MP who is Vice Chair of that committee. Welcome to you all. Mark, you got to help me on this one. Why would a bureaucrat like Daniel Jean, who's been around a long time, think that it was his obligation to go forth and correct misinformation and get a list of reporters from the Prime Minister to call up and doing this apparently all on his own? Why would he do it? It's just not done.
Well, I think he made it very clear today that the reality is that there was an effort to impugn the reputation of the RCMP, of CSIS, of the High Commission, that effort was coordinated and completely ungrounded in reality. And therefore, he thought it important to correct the record. And let's talk about the record. Mr. Jean has been an extraordinary public servant, not only in our government, not only in Mr. Harper's government, but over successive governments, somebody who has done a remarkable job serving Canadians. And you know, we've said all along that this story was very straightforward and clear. I think that was evidenced today. And we hope that, that Mr. Scheer, the opposition leader, we're still waiting for him to take a briefing on this so that he can be fully informed of all the facts so that they're not in a position where they can claim to be ignorant.
Matthew, unanswered questions today? Any come down the pipe for you?
Definitely. I think I heard the word narrative more times than I expected to. I'm hearing things like correcting the record, correcting facts, and certainly without disputing Mr. Jean's record of public service, without disputing the nobleness of wanting to protect the RCMP and CSIS and the High Commission. At the end of the day, I wonder what he said in that briefing that the Prime Minister couldn't say himself. Public servants, when they're doing that kind of intervention, that's very political and communication-oriented in nature, I think it's usually more of a technical side that they're supposed to bring in. So I kind of question what the chain of command is. How does he end up being in that situation? I believe him when he says he acted alone, but at some point there has to be accountability. And I think that lies on the PMO for how they're deploying these resources. And I say that with all due respect, in that kind of situation.
You know, Aaron, I don't recall hearing a lot today that wasn't included in those journalist stories coverage. So what's missing here? What questions did you want to have answered that weren't?
Well, what I found interesting is when he had, stories the CBC ran following the briefing. The first paragraph said a senior advisor to the Prime Minister on Security suggested there was an Indian conspiracy theory. David Aiken said that Mr. Jean worked that into his briefing. Today, he kind of stepped away from that, suggesting he's just correcting the record where RCMP and other agencies were being besmirched. Well, we didn't see any of that. What was interesting is I asked him two key questions. Would there be a scandal if the Liberal MP had not invited Mr. Atwell, or if the Prime Minister's office had properly vetted him? He said no to both questions. There'd be no scandal. So this is a Liberal scandal. And the fact that the National Security Advisor is kind of dragged into it, we still don't have the Prime Minister clearly saying to Canadians and to the government of India that they had nothing to do with Atwell being there. I'd like to hear that from him.
Right, and that is an unanswered question. Who were this element that was supposedly he thought might have been fiddling about and making Canada try and look bad?
Well, look, and this is really interesting. That if you look back at Mr. Jean's testimony today, his previous statements, the statement of the Prime Minister, there has never been a statement that the Indian government was responsible for this. The only ones who made that assertion, and it was made in the House of Commons, was the Conservatives. And so it's reckless and irresponsible. And because they refused to get a briefing, and they absolutely refused.
Well, he's going to get one in 2 weeks.
2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. It's already been 3 weeks. They could have been asking questions from a position of knowledge. They preferred to be asking from a position of ignorance. No, excuse me, if I could finish. They prefer to ask from a position of ignorance. And so the question is very simple, which is why on earth is Mr. Scheer not taken this opportunity yet to make himself informed?
I asked him just a few minutes ago. He said, I've given a few dates. We're going to see what dates work for Mr. Jean.
Don, why it's a smokescreen? Mr. Jean confirmed today that the offer of a briefing to privy councillors like Andrew Scheer or myself didn't even come until the filibuster was underway.
Right.
So we had been asking twice at Public Safety Committee. We had a whole day of debate in the House. We voted around the clock, Don, all because we wanted to say which is true, the Prime Minister's suggestions that Mr. Jean and the briefing and the Indian conspiracy theory, or Randeep Sarai taking responsibility. And Minister Goodale went so far as to say, when we were asking questions, we can't talk about classified information in the House. So they perpetuated this story out there that there was a conspiracy at play. So they can't use it to hide for months.
In the House,
if you look at what Daniel Jean is saying, and he wants to clear up the situation, he wanted to correct misinformation. At the end of the day, I mean, and suffice it to say, the trip was a disaster from A to Z, but this has just perpetuated this problem. He went in there trying to solve a problem and made it worse. And without wanting to put a pox on him or his house, I think the Prime Minister has to take accountability for that and say he's on a foreign trip. He's got his national security advisor. He ultimately is responsible for Privy Council and how the government is operating. And so you have to ask yourself, if you're allowing this chaos to unfold, when do you show leadership and rein it in these types of sensitive matters?
But help me explain to the viewers, why should anyone care about this? What's at stake here, Aaron? I mean, that you can say this signals something major as a flaw in this government.
Well, the Trudeau trip was meant to actually repair damage from an earlier trip Minister Sajjan had to India, where there was a bit of a diplomatic kerfuffle. It was blinded because it was the same trip Minister Sajjan suggested he was the architect of a battle in Afghanistan. That became the story, but there's been a fraying of the relationship under the Liberals. This was meant to fix it, but they allowed someone who tried to kill an Indian politician on Canadian soil. I know it was, in the 1980s. They allowed him to attend events with all the Liberal insiders and the Prime Minister. They own it. It was done by the Liberals, approved by the Prime Minister's office, and there was no news story out about a possible Indian conspiracy bringing him there until after Mr. Jean started doing his briefings. That causes real concern because Mr. Jean, inserting himself into this, was seen to be defending the Liberals and providing a counter narrative.
So I think that's important that you would focus your attacks on Mr. Jean. I think that he is somebody who has demonstrated in his public service enormous dedication to this country, Aaron. But I just want to say that on the facts, and they were presented today, Mr. Jean said that there was erroneous information, false information, not a different opinion, but factually incorrect information that was damaging the reputation of the RCMP, CSIS, and the High Commission. That's why he felt it was important to intercede. And asking questions from a position of ignorance, refusing 3 weeks.
There was
it's
no
been over
such
3
offer.
weeks. Just let me finish. Has led to, for example, this false story that they're propagating about canceled meetings. So when they are in a position where they don't have the facts, frankly, this is what we wind up with. They're getting duped into stories that are untrue.
I mean, if it does get classified information, you can't use it anyway. So would he change his attacks much? I mean, what he knows is...
Sure, but what he knows is there was a coordinated effort, and this is what you heard today, there was a coordinated effort to disseminate false information that impugned the reputation of three of... Well, this is why you need your classified briefing. He's obviously said that some of that information crosses into classified.
At times they say it was the Liberal MP invited him. But now we say we can't tell you the full story about the Indian government because you need a classified briefing.
So
are you admitting it was the Indian government?
I never said it was the Indian government, and that is a complete distortion. What I said was that we heard today Mr. Jean say there were elements that had tried to pursue false information and give that information. He wanted to correct it. And now what the opportunity is for us to get on record what the facts are. That happened today.
Let's see what happens. Last word to you. What are you looking for? What's the big question that you'd ask, classified or unclassified, that would make Canadians go, wow, that's a big story?
For me, it's the accountability in the Prime Minister's office. Like I said, at the end of the day, Mr. Jean has said that he was ready and willing to appear before committee. Yep. He didn't. He made this intervention. He's a national security advisor. It's not a small role. So why is he being allowed to do this? What's the next steps? How are they going to make sure we're not in this mess again?
Why doesn't the Prime Minister deploy some of those well-paid communication specialists? They're supposed to do this job. Trust me, I've been corrected by the PMO more than a few times.
Exactly, it's a great question. And he's highly competent, but he's not a communications expert.
If somebody from the Prime Minister's office had come out and said that this information was factually incorrect, the opposition would have said, oh, well, it's the Prime Minister's office saying it. This was an attack on the institutions of the RCMP, CSIS, and the High Commission. It had to be corrected by a nonpartisan source that people would trust. That makes sense to me. And the idea that that it was a conspiracy of the Indian government was not voiced by Mr. Jean, was not voiced by the Prime Minister. It was voiced by the Conservatives, who every day tried to pursue this line of attack and basically tried to create this myth.
We're going around in circles, but thank you all. We appreciate you coming in, and we'll see what happens. I'm not sure if the story's over or not. Thanks again.